Well, we have the luxury here in the Ruthless Variety program of every once in a while having some super VIP guests.
That's right.
And as you can see,
It's getting deep in here already.
we have the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, John Thune. Welcome.
Thanks, Josh. Good to be with you. Mike, nice to see you.
This
Thanks for having me.
this is great. So listen, you're a couple months on the job. I've consistently said this might be the hardest job, maybe in all of America, but certainly in Washington, is wrangling a bunch of senators to try to get mutual goals accomplished, particularly the front end of an administration. But you look around, I mean, you guys are way ahead of pace on nominations, confirmations, not without controversy, but somehow you've just managed to line these things up despite Democrats trying to stop you at all turns.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's good. It's a good team ball. I mean, we've had really good cooperation, and I'll tell you, it's nice to have 53.
Yeah, right.
Instead of 50 or 51 in the Senate. But the confirmation process is challenging because if the Democrats want to, they can drag it out, and they have been. But we've been able to use and manage the clock, I think, well, and force them to concede on a lot of things and to give us essentially what we wanted in terms of the schedule. So we got through it pretty well. We got a couple left, and we'll try and finish those up. But Senator McConnell always reminded us that the Senate spends 2/3 of its time on personnel.
Yeah.
You think about it.
Yeah.
We're like a human resources factory, and there's 1,100 executive branch positions that come through the Senate for confirmation, and then you add on top of that all the judges, the entire judiciary. And it's just a consuming thing. So it makes it really hard to legislate. And to your point, in the Senate, you've got all these procedures and rules you have to follow that the Democrats can use to stall and slow things down. So it makes it hard to do anything. I frankly am of the mind, and I would say this for a Republican or a Democrat president, we ought to cut that about in half. I don't think when the founders put advice and consent into the Constitution, they were thinking about 1,100. I mean, you get presidents who don't get their people in place until the third year of a 4-year term. Yeah. And that's just, it doesn't make sense.
It is absurd.
But you're still confirming here on the fastest clip since 2001.
Right, correct.
And while doing that, you're also getting good legislation in place here. Can you tell us about this Women in Sports Act that I know y'all are working on?
Yeah, so we're going to put that on the floor early next week, and it's an issue the House has voted on. And the president issued an executive order. And what this would do is codify the executive order. But essentially, it bans biological males from competing in women's sports. Yeah. And
just the right thing to do.
Yeah. Well, and as a girl dad, both of our daughters, and now I've got granddaughters, were very active in sports. I've got my oldest daughter is in both her high school and college Hall of Fame, and so
the Thunes are into sports. I
Yeah,
didn't know
yeah,
that.
go figure,
Sure.
right? But so it's intuitively, I think people this is why this is an 80-20 issue. It's people like, yeah, well, of course, right? And it's unfortunate that it's something that needs to be codified, but we're going to try and make sure that the President CEO endures over time, and the way to do that is to have Congress to take action. My assumption is we'll get a lot of resistance, obviously, from the Democrats,
Which is unbelievable at some level.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, like I said, I think there are some things. Clearly there are partisan political issues in our times and things that we deal with legislatively, which create sort of the deep political divide that we have. But this one, to me, it just seems like it's just common sense. I mean, logic. Once in a while, you ought to yield to logic and just say this makes makes all the sense in the world.
This is Washington.
Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to feature how you could formulate an argument against that, but we're going to find out here in a few days what the Dems think.
Yeah, no kidding. So, I mean, look, one of the underrated parts of the job that you have is, Senate at some level has to work with some consensus left and right in order to move anything. You've been able to roll through that with the nomination and confirmation process despite Democrats doing everything. And so there has to be some level of comedy. How difficult is that? Because, right now you saw all of these nominations where you'd settled, you had the votes, it was going to happen, they make you run the clock no matter what, and then they head out to a press conference at USAID, which I mean, they're beclowning themselves. So politically it's not the worst thing in the world, but you got to be watching this and saying, like, come on.
Well, I mean, I think that you pick and choose the issues you want to highlight, and they're picking and choose issues that I just, I'm like, really? This is what you want to talk about? But, there are times, you're right, and you know this as well as anybody, Josh, where in the Senate particularly, because of the rules, you have to find it on some issues, including spending bills, bipartisan cooperation. It takes 60 votes, not 51, to do anything consequential in the Senate, with the exception of budget reconciliation, which when you have unified control of the government, House, Senate, and White House, you can do things at 51 that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And obviously that's a situation we're now in, and we intend to do everything we can to take advantage of that. But you still have to, when it comes to doing a farm bill, for example, that's a bipartisan exercise. Yep. Or like I said, funding the government. There are any number of things that if you're going to do them, you're going to have some Democrat cooperation. And right now it's really hard because the Democrats are just so spun up. I mean, they're over the strangest things. But this Trump derangement syndrome is real on their side. And it is, they can't see straight. Now, even when we were going through the budget resolution process last week, and when I adjourned the Senate at 4:51 a.m., we stayed up all night and voted.
It's a fun process.
On Democrat, you've been there, on Democrat amendments, and some of them are just, and some of these folks on their side, they were just, they can't contain themselves. They are just so much anger and hostility right now. Yeah. And I think they're coming out of an election, and they're just trying to find their footing and find something they can get traction with, and trying to find an identity.
Most folks when they take an electoral beating, they sort of sit back for a minute and say, all right, what do we do wrong?
Yeah.
Let's think about what we're not communicating to the American people. Maybe our issue set is a little off. And it strikes me that Schumer and these guys have done the exact opposite. They just fire at everything.
Yeah, they're crabs in a barrel, and they're fighting over each other to get out.
Yeah.
And it's just like these very niche things, and the anger, and they just can't help themselves.
And not everything is a constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and as I pointed out in a floor speech not that long ago, they are attacking the Trump administration for use of executive power.
Yeah.
And I was like, where were these guys in the last 4 years?
That's an interesting
where there were all
concept.
these abuses of executive power, and every president comes in, and there's this tension between the branches of the government, inevitably, and but right now they picking, for example, DOJ and USAID, you get outside, you get 800 meters from this building, and people agree with that. They think the government ought to be downsized, and we ought to do things in a more efficient, smarter way, and make our government more cost effective. And modernize it with technology. I think those are things that most people agree on. But, they've opted to pick, USAID or whatever that particular program is, and turn it into some sort of a cause to raise money from their base. But I think what they're losing sight of, and it's sometimes easy to do this, is the broader, the middle of the electorate, the people in this country who are paying the bills, the taxpayers, who are ultimately on the hook for the cost of government, see this through a different lens.
Yeah.
And those are the folks that gave Trump the win and gave us the majorities in the House and the Senate. And
it turns out those people aren't their voters.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
They don't represent them any longer.
Yeah, they really. There's been a change, and you're right. Coming out of that, you think, okay, let's do a little self-reflection here.
Right. No,
they're doubling down.
They're
really
are
doubling down. Yeah.
So, look, now you get to the portion of the program where you're going to be dealing with core sort of Trump administration priorities of your members,
right.
House Republicans, and there's a bunch of big stuff that needs to happen. You took a huge step by passing the budget last week, which big accomplishment there. I don't think people would actually realize each piece of this step is as difficult as it actually is. But then this unlocks the ability to do reconciliation and ultimately get the tax cuts done, get the important pieces with energy, immigration, all of this various stuff. It's not going to be easy. I imagine with your conversations with the speaker and with the president, you guys are kind of working through the formulation of how you're going to handle that now.
Yeah, and there's some decision points ahead.
This is the one big beautiful.
The one big beautiful. Yes, yeah. But you do. Historically, if you go back 100 years, There have been 5 times when Republicans have had unified control of the government. By that I mean House, Senate, White House. And 4 of those 5 times it only lasted 2 years. And the other time it lasted 4 years. So it doesn't come along very often and sometimes doesn't last very long. And so the use of budget reconciliation to accomplish things at a 51 vote threshold in the Senate is unique historically, but it's a real opportunity for us. And so locking in and hopefully making permanent the 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump tax cuts, whatever you want to call them, is a part of that. Doing some things on, a deficit reduction, getting us on a more sustainable fiscal path, I think, too, is part of it. And that's where DOGE comes in and some of the other ideas with respect to trying to rein in spending. Energy policy, things that we can do to make America more energy dominant, I think is, a part of this conversation. Things that we can do to secure the border. There are a whole range of things that we believe are eligible for and that we ought to be able to, and part of it is in the Senate. You got to get past the parliamentarian.
Yep.
She's like the referee of all this, but there are things I think we can do based upon the use by the Democrats when they had unified control of the government.
That's how we
They
got
did- they-
Obamacare, folks.
That but then we got the American Rescue Plan,
The
the Inflation Reduction Act. Those were all done through budget reconciliation, and they created a template by expanding the scope of what is eligible under budget reconciliation for us to do some things that we think really need to be done. And but chief among those really is if we can make that tax policy permanent and create certainty in the economy, predictability around tax policy. And to me, tax policy always ought to be about growth. Economic growth, the old axiom that a rising tide lifts all the boats. You get a growing economy, better paying jobs, people are making money, they're taking realizations, and they're paying taxes, and government revenue goes up. I mean, one of the ways that you deal with deficits long term is you restrain spending, obviously, but then you also create growth in the economy. When the economy is growing and expanding, it generates more revenue, and it makes a lot of these problems that we have look smaller by comparison.
No question.
So in, extending those tax cuts, from Trump's first term and everything, the thing that really bothers me is in the conversation, the media and the Democrats and every once in a while some Republicans too talk about these pay-fors for tax cuts like this isn't the people's money in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned that other side of it, which is like unleashing the American economy on things like energy and all that. So could you give our listeners sort of a preview of what that might look like, that component, the growth component to the American economy that really allows us to take off?
Yeah, so if you think about it, Mike, and obviously, to me, and when we went through 2017, and I was on the Senate Finance Committee and helped negotiate a lot of the policy, particularly around the small business provisions, the 199A for pass-through businesses.
Very big.
And those things, and
If we
and
could
they-
slap podcasts in this.
I was going to
together,
say
let's get
that's,
that.
well,
Great.
there's a carve out for podcasts, especially. But the whole objective was, if you want to get faster growth in the economy, lower rates and faster cost recovery. And so bonus depreciation, interest deductibility, R&D expensing were all provisions that generated significant amount of economic growth. And when you get that growth, the standard rule of thumb is that for every 1% increase in GDP, you get about $3 trillion in additional tax revenue over a decade. So
This is math that
growth
has eluded
benefits
Democrats.
everybody. Yeah, and people are you've got incentives for investment, which is creating those better paying jobs, and again, it improves people's standard of living, quality of life. And if you look at what happened in the aftermath of 2017, at least prior to the pandemic, we were actually closing the income disparity in this country.
Right.
People in the lower end of the income categories were seeing the biggest growth in income, and unemployment was at a 50-year low. So there are, in my view, these policies don't happen in a vacuum. They create the conditions that are favorable for making America an attractive place to invest. And I think it's tax policy. I also think it's regulatory policy and lightening that touch. And that's another thing that when Trump came in, a lot of executive orders that are designed to do away with some of this heavy-handed, burdensome regulatory framework that the Biden administration created,
Yeah, and
a
the
lot of it
energy space
and a
too,
lot of it
right?
around energy. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so unleashing American energy, trying to figure out how to reform our permitting process so that you can get through the siting and the all those things faster, and then also open up more areas for energy development. And in my view, is if it's American, it ought to be in all of the above. We ought to support and encourage and incentivize investment in American energy and become not only a country that can take care of our own energy needs, but hopefully help with some of our allies who are too dangerously dependent upon countries like Russia.
Yeah.
No kidding. I think you've done an absolutely terrific job of wrangling Senate Republicans, many of which are just sort of ideologically aligned on this stuff, but understanding the opportunities ahead and being able to not quibble over every thing on the way to actually getting the opportunity to do these big things. I mean, you hear a lot of Republicans you were mentioning talking about, you're paying for tax cuts, this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, man, what you just explained is the reason that conversation doesn't work. I mean, what you just explained is the revenue growth, which Democrats will never concede, CBO won't even concede,
Right. Yeah.
is your economy is growing much faster than you could tax your way out of when you're lowering the rates. And that's ultimately the conversation that'll happen primarily in the House with House Republicans. But ultimately, you guys need to get together on that, I'm assuming you and Johnson. And
Yeah, I mean, we'll figure it out. And you're right. We've got some folks who think, this got to be offset. We got to pay for this or that. But this is extending existing tax policy.
Right.
And I still hear John Kyle in my ear, on that. We don't pay for extending existing tax policy. But the Democrats, oddly enough, their argument now is that we're cutting taxes to give tax cuts to billionaires. And I'm like,
what an amazing.
This is the law today. What are we cutting? I mean, all we're doing, so this is the current policy. This is the current law. And
trick pony stuff.
To think that you somehow can and make an argument that because what's going to happen at the end of the year if we don't do anything is a $4.5 trillion tax increase, a majority of which falls on ordinary Americans, people who make and families who make less than $400,000 a year. So there's a huge part of this tax policy, and this is the thing I feel like in 2017. Unfortunately, the Democrat narrative. They did a pretty good job of getting out there and making this about tax cuts for the rich, and nothing could be further from the truth.
No, I know.
I mean, if you look at, and we paid a lot of attention to the distribution tables and how does this, the proportion of taxes paid by different income categories, the tax code actually became more progressive. After 2017 than it was prior to. In other words, people in the lower income categories were paying less of the tax burden, and people in the higher end were paying
you made
more.
the mistake of doing math.
That's the funniest. The funniest part of all of this is we're about to find out how much they actually believe the lie.
Right, yeah, that's right. Yes, yeah, totally.
So the last piece of housekeeping you've got in March, government funding. That's never a pleasant exercise.
No.
Left over from a previous Congress, left to you all to try to figure out how to get funded for the rest of the year. What do you think?
Yeah, so as you guys all know, the federal fiscal year starts October 1. So we're halfway into fiscal year 25. And even though last year in the Senate and under the leadership on the Republican side of Senator Collins, 11 of the 12 appropriation bills were reported out. And they were reported out before the end of July of last year. And a number of them came out unanimously. In spite of that, Chuck Schumer never put a single one on the floor.
Yeah, weird. It's almost like he was trying to.
He's trying to create this pileup. And after the election went the way it did, I think then he doubled down on not wanting to do anything. And so now we're faced with this, funding deadline, and the Democrats are out there publicly, if you can believe this, talking about shutting down the government.
Oh yeah, this is what they
and in a mess that was entirely left to us by them. This is a pileup that was created by their inactivity and failure to do the basic tasks of funding the government last year, and so now we're having to clean up after that. And we're figuring out, the best way to accomplish that, to make sure that we keep the government funded, but in a way that is consistent with the overall goals that we have with regard to fiscal sustainability, fiscal responsibility, and moving us in a different direction as a country. And then fiscal year 26, which now will be on our watch, we can start getting underway with. But it's just unfortunate that we have to clean up fiscal year
Other people's
25
mess.
under
They're
people's
super-
mess. Yeah.
Super good at not doing anything.
They really are.
been-
They've turned it into an art form. Yeah,
So, listen, last question. For all the years I was in the Senate, I think you were the land speed Senate holder for running around the Capitol. There was nobody who could touch Thune. I'm wondering, with the new, we've gotten younger. Got a younger class. Is anybody threatening your 40 time?
Yeah, well, we've got some. We haven't laced them up lately to see if anybody's got what it takes. But
That's good. You got to blow off some steam, though. Maybe
well-
just take it right down the Ohio Clock corridor, straight across.
yeah,
the
that's right. That's right. So
Powered by
when
some great honey.
when you have, and you got to take a spoonful of that before you do it.
Yeah,
But
seriously.
one of the for a while there, they had this race that I used to run. It was the 3-mile run, and the Capitol Challenge, they called it. And for a while, I was like the fastest person in Congress. And so I would always remind people that's like being the best surfer in Kansas. It's a nice title to have, but it really doesn't mean much. And it
Great.
So yeah, but we've got some really great young senators who've joined us. And
Seems like a lot of energy.
There's a lot of energy.
Yeah.
Very
Comes
exciting.
with an education, as we
Yeah.
always know.
Yeah.
But you're doing an absolutely terrific job. These are the South Dakota products that you've brought us. These are
Yeah. Little beef jerky.
Yeah.
the honey's going
We
to
make
keep us
popcorn
healthy.
cinnamon. Yeah, that's right.
We got some bison in here too, which I
Yeah.
always appreciate.
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome.
And this doesn't exactly look like Skinny Pop over here. This is Galen's. This is Honey Farms, 80
Yeah.
Honey Farms. Wow.
That may not be Maha type, but it's going to go down smooth. I can tell you that.
Oh yeah.
How's the Jackrabbit basketball team? doing?
They're decent. I think it's a wide open tournament this year. Our conference tournament will start here in another week or so. The women are ranked. Jackrabbit women are 20. They're top 25 in the country. And the men have had a nice season, and I think they very well could win the tournament. So, go Jacks.
Go Jacks.
Yeah.
Go Jacks. Listen, Majority Leader Thune, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Mike.